Hi Travis, Amy here. I'm really sorry that I didn't get time to look at your draft in class yesterday, but thank you very much for emailing it to me. I thought that I would go ahead and make a video because then it might be easier for me to actually show you what I'm talking about in terms of my suggestions rather than typing them out into one big paragraph. So hopefully this will work a little bit better. Overall, you're in pretty good shape, but I'm going to talk about how you can connect more directly to the different types of rhetorical appeals, the logic, credibility, and emotion in terms of the points you're making. They're all there and they're all suggested in the essay, but I would like to see you talk about those terms a little more directly by actually using those words and that kind of thing. Just to start out, you do a good job introducing the article here, and you have a pretty strong paraphrase of the writer's thesis, so great job with that. A couple of nitpicky things. You do need to italicize the publication title and go ahead and capitalize the publication title there. And then down in your discussion of his thesis, I would say that you do need to move this word just to after the word today, and that'll make the sentence flow a little bit better. So, he's written a persuasive article progressing through the history of hunter-gatherers that taught themselves through discovery to the more traditional ways of schooling today that is more like work. The other thing you might do here is just indicate that he thinks this is a bad thing and he thinks this is a good thing. Because right now you say he is writing a persuasive article and that this is what it's about, but you don't really say which of these he's more in favor of. So that's, again, kind of small, and you do a good job covering everything here, but just to allude to his persuasion a little bit more, what exactly is he trying to persuade his readers toward, this point of view or this point of view. Okay, so in your thesis, you do a good job outlining your points, but I would say you could streamline this a little bit. So I would suggest combining your 1, 2, 3 main points of analysis into one sentence instead of 3. So one way you could do that is with a semicolon. Typically it's going to be harder to get your contrast point, which in this case is a weakness because your other points are strengths, into the same sentence as everything else. But one thing you can do to alleviate that problem is to use a semicolon, because semicolons act just like periods. They just bring two sentences a little bit closer together into the same sentence. The other thing you could do is combine these two strengths into one sentence using what we call a parallel construction. So Gray does have several strengths which include this and this, and that Gray is a very well educated individual. So the reason we call this a parallel construction is because you have the first part of the sentence that applies to not only one thing but also another thing later in the sentence. So it's kind of like this applies to this and to this. So that makes it easier to get it all into one sentence. And then you actually have already, if you do those things, condensed it down to just two sentences, because even though this is a semicolon, technically this whole thing is one sentence, and then this is another sentence. So that'll get it a little bit more streamlined for you there. A nitpicky thing, I would say that of is probably not the correct word here, because you remember that a bias is either leaning heavily for or against something, and so the word of here is just a little too general or a little too vague to indicate what he is biased for or against. So I would use in favor of or toward or for or against. His bias is in favor of total reform. So that would just be a little more precise language for you. And then here is where I think you can actually get, as I was saying in the very beginning of the video, get a more direct connection to the rhetorical appeal. So you talk about bias here. That's definitely a credibility point. So I would just say his bias in favor of total reform of traditional schools hurts his credibility. And then in the next sentence, Gray does have several strengths, which include many factual arguments. Say something about logic here. So which include logical facts about how the school system has evolved to the way it is today, And then down here you can connect to credibility as well, and that Gray is a very well-educated and credible individual. So that's going to push your discussion just a little bit more strongly into the analysis realm, because you're actually using those critical words like logic, emotion, credibility, and that kind of thing. And then the other thing I saw once I thought about this being a credibility point is that you really go from your first point, which is a weakness, this is a credibility point, to your second point, which is a strength about logic, and then back to a strength about credibility. So one thing you might consider doing is switching the order of these 2 points so that your point about him being well-educated and credible comes first, and then your point about the logical, factual evidence comes second, and that way you can go from a credibility weakness to a credibility strength to a logical strength. And that'll be a little bit more logical for you as well, because you're talking about your credibility points together rather than splitting them up with this logic point in between. So that's what I said there. This point here, he'll definitely get you thinking about school reform. That to me is related to his purpose, because that's his goal, right? Is to change the way people are thinking. So I think this sounds more like a logic point. So you might even drag this up to earlier when you make your logic point. So you could say something that will definitely get you thinking, something like this. Gray does have several strengths, which include many factual, or you could even say many pieces of factual evidence as to how we have evolved in today's schooling that will definitely get you thinking about school reform, and that Gray is a very well-educated individual. And then you could just take this part out, and again, it's going to be a more streamlined sentence that way too. So you know, you're still going to have to put the words logic and credibility in, but you could just do this here, something like that, and then up here you could say, you could even change this, instead of factual evidence, you could say logical facts. And then, again, mention credibility up here. His bias in favor of total reform of traditional school hurts his credibility. His cred. Okay, so let's get down into your paragraphs. Oh, sorry, before I go on to that, you have a really good start toward recommending the article here. You say it'll be interesting, but I would tell her to actually go read it, and that's going to address the thesis statement that you're trying to write a little bit better. Okay, so now going into the paragraphs. Just like you should be adding words like credibility to your thesis up here, you want to add those words to your topic sentences as well. So I would just say he's extremely biased, which hurts his credibility, or something along those lines. Okay, sorry. You know, which hurts his credibility right here. And then a lot of this actually needs attributive tags, and I'm going to try to point those out throughout the essay, but it was sometimes hard to tell if you were saying things that were your own opinion or if you were actually talking about what Gray says, so watch out for that. This statement is almost a little bit inaccurate to what Gray is arguing in the article. You say, so in his opening paragraph, he states that if we didn't have schools the way they are today, kids would not grow up to be functioning adults and competent. This is actually not what he thinks. Remember, this is from the part of the article where he's being really sarcastic, and what he actually says is, perhaps if we didn't have schools the way they are today, kids would not grow up to be functioning adults. Perhaps, but that's not actually his point of view. He's saying that sarcastically to kind of call out the alternative point of view. And so that bleeds into what you say in the next sentence, which is that you think your wife would disagree, but in fact, since Gray doesn't actually agree with this, he's saying it sarcastically, it almost sounds like your wife and Gray would really agree on these things. And so I think this whole discussion could just be a little bit reworked, starting with this sentence to indicate that this isn't actually his point of view, this is the opposite of his point of view, and that's where you could pull in some examples of words like perhaps to show that he has that sarcastic tone. You know, you have an example here, but a couple of more examples would probably help. And then so since he's actually saying the opposite, I think your wife would probably agree. But in that case, you might just want to take this out. I think it's good to reach out to your reader and say, here's what you would think, but you're trying to show that he's biased and that this is a weakness that because it hurts his credibility in the article. And so the fact that they're ultimately going to end up agreeing here might undermine that point a little bit. So I would just refocus this statement to be more interpretation of his biases and less about just generally agreeing and disagreeing. So just a couple of nitpicky things here. You don't need to say no longer here because you say it a couple words later. You need an extra word here just to make the sentence flow. I would say when or something. You also have a spelling error there, early 17th century when kids were beaten into obedience. This quote starts out, but it doesn't end anywhere, so make sure you put a close quotation marks at the end. And then in general, you've kind of lost focus on the idea of his biases and how it's a weakness because it hurts his credibility by the end of this paragraph. So you want to refocus this on what you actually introduced in your topic sentence. And that's something I noticed throughout. You kind of start the paragraph talking about the point that you're making in your topic sentence, but by the end of the paragraph you switch topics a little bit. So try to focus each paragraph just on what you're previewing in the topic sentence, give us some examples of it, and recap the point again at the end of the paragraph as well. And then, like I said, for your thesis, this point about factual evidence needs to be connected to logic. So just mention the word logical here, his logical use of facts or something like that. I thought that this word choice was a little questionable. He starts with the hunter-gatherers learning on their own, and once the advent of agriculture and the need for people to work, what? But you know, so it sounds kind of like a sentence fragment here, but you could make it a complete sentence by saying, and then moves on to discuss the advent of agriculture and the need for people to work or something like that. Just make this more of a chronological transition rather than a adjective, which is what it is right now. And then let's see. Oh, this whole section needs attributive tags. So this is where I was saying it's hard to tell if these were your ideas, but I know that they are actually Gray's because I've read the article. So you just need to attribute both of these sentences to him to make that distinction more clear. And then this is a sentence fragment. It's not a complete sentence because it doesn't have a verb. It's only got a subject or a noun. And so an easy way to make this a complete sentence would be to just use a comma and combine it with the previous sentence instead. And then again, as I mentioned kind of up here, again, you've kind of lost focus on the logical facts of the argument, and you're by the end of the paragraph leaning more toward your actual opinion on whether or not this kind of reform needs to happen. Instead, I'd like you to focus the paragraph just on his logical use of facts and then recap this here at the end of the paragraph. And then finally, this sounds like a logic point the way you're introducing your topic sentence here, but I know from your thesis and what you actually talk about in the paragraph that this should be a point about his credibility based on his credentials and his areas of expertise. So I would rework the topic sentence here to better match the way you previewed the point in your thesis at the beginning of the essay. Just say something similar to what you said up here. He's a well-educated and interesting individual, or a credible individual. And if you say that in your topic sentence here, again, that'll really drive home the analysis. Here are a couple of more places where you need author tags, so remember everything from the article needs to be attributed to Gray. And then, let's see. Here again, you've kind of lost focus. I think you can relate to this from experience you've had. This is more of an audience point, and I noticed that you're missing a point about the emotional connections to the audience in the essay. You have 2 credibility points and a logic point. And you're also a little bit shy of the length requirement. So one thing you might consider doing is breaking this out into its own paragraph about connections to the audience's emotions here as a strength. And then you would have to add that point to your thesis at the beginning and in your conclusion at the end. And that would help you with your length a little bit, and it would also help take this out of the paragraph, which is really about credibility, because right now this seems more like a distraction, and then you could connect back to credibility at the end of this paragraph to wrap it up instead. You have a pretty good start to recapping everything in your works cited, but you don't directly mention your points about credibility and logic, so make sure you recap all your points in order, whatever order they end up ultimately being in, and you also don't mention your weakness point about his biases in the conclusion here, so I would add that, again, in order, so make sure you're recapping everything. And then I know you forgot your works cited, but just add that at the end. Thanks.